next half an hour or so, we've got 4 people who are going to offer 4 different perspectives on one central issue. The central issue is this: constructing extraordinary reputations, what makes a building truly iconic? Now, we are going to have some discussion on this, but rather than framing it as a panel discussion, what we've asked each of these people to do is to prepare a 5-minute presentation, and thank you, panelists, for sticking to 5 minutes and respecting everyone's time, a 5-minute presentation outlining their position on this central idea, what makes a building truly iconic. And do we have our panelists? Are they ready now? I know they've been getting ready. Christina, is Christina here? Christina's here and ready to go. So let me first of all introduce the first of our speakers. She is the principal at Studio Ceylon Architecture. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Christina Ceylon. Christina, join us, please.
First of all, when we were asked to do this, this presentation, we as an office never think about iconic, and it's not something that we set out to do. But so I never had to really think about it previously, and so I set about thinking what really does make a building iconic and what does it mean. So it's something that is groundbreaking, sets new standards. Anyway, none of it really fitted what I felt was the meaning of iconic, especially the last sentence, which becomes a benchmark for other similar products, meaning something that you would then copy. So then I set about looking at cities, and Paris, you know, which are the iconic buildings that define certain cities. Paris has a building which is not a building. It's a structure that was designed to be demolished. It was a structure that was very unloved when it was built. In fact, there was a collaborative group of artists, the most prominent artists of its time, who wrote to the city planners, basically asking them to not build this structure, and as it neither was architecture nor engineering nor art. And it's become one of the most loved and visited places in the world. Sydney has a structure which was designed by a Dane. Utzon won the Pritzker Prize on this structure. It's probably his most famous building. He was fired from the job by his clients, and there were a lot of conflictive stories throughout the process. He moved to Sydney to build it, but it's really a building that became to define a city, and it sits within its site, and it sort of, as a structure, is a fantastic piece of architecture, but also a fantastic site and a fantastic location. So it became a symbol not just for for Sydney, sorry, but it also became a symbol for the whole country and its continent. Bilbao, we all know about the Bilbao effect. It's the interesting part is that this was the moment of decon architecture, a very sort of bold move from Bilbao, a very expensive building that they built. But interestingly enough, the tourism that this building brought to Bilbao in terms of the generating of taxes paid and more for the building. So it was an incredibly successful building in terms of defining a region that was generally not known and not visited and quite in decline. Anyway, I talked about this. And then there are other iconic buildings, and this is one that is probably more iconic to me or architects. This is when I was taking my first class of architecture at MIT. This was the MIT chapel. It's an absolutely wonderful, tiny little structure which defines modernism in so many ways and is iconic in a very special way, in a very private way. So iconic doesn't always need to be large or bold or weird, or it can have a very sort of private and poetic moment, and can really define a campus. And I think this structure on the campus is and was really one of the most loved and visited structures for architects. So when we go about designing buildings, we think much more about how we work both in the UK, and 50% of our work is abroad, and we think a lot about what does it mean to be working abroad, and how do we as foreigners work in a place like that. And we all think that the building has to rise from its site, and it is not something that should really be replicated or should really be able to sort of seen everywhere. So we were asked for a competition, and we were asked to do a beautiful, iconic building, which in a sense was a bit of a soulless ask. We thought, how can we make this problem be not only intelligent but meaningful? And so if you look at a residential tower, the most efficient tower is really a core and the apartments around. So this is the most efficiency that you could get. So we wanted to be commercial and remain very efficient. And then we thought, well, what if we were to start to get the shape out of the balconies? And something that we discovered in the design process, and this is where the balconies go from 8 meters to 0 meters, is that there was this moire effect that started to happen, and the building started becoming alive. And this was a complete surprise. This is not, we didn't set out to design that. It sort of came about. So I'm trying to get to the next slide. So these balconies that go ever decreasing as you get to the top was a very pragmatic response. At the lower levels, the wind is calm. At the upper levels, you've got high winds, so you have less opportunities of sitting outside calmly. There's obviously the shading response. This is a project that is here in the Middle East. And then there was this other issue of the mashrabaya, the notion of privacy. How can you look at the street without being seen? And this became very important in terms of the spa, the swimming pool, the restaurant, sort of a privacy element also for the residences alike. So these were all the factors really guiding the design of this building. When it came to the building itself, I mean, one of the things that I find incredibly apparent in Dubai is that every building is slightly yellow from the sand, and every window, whenever you go to an office, I was in Arab this morning, and looking out of the window, it's completely hazy. And so how do you design with this element? And the desert became the inspiration for this building, and then we created this tower with ever-receding balconies where the reflection is high at the top, so it becomes sort of more reflective and white at the top, and at the base you have the balconies that come ever increasing. And so it creates these opportunities for landscapes, for proper gardens on the buildings. It creates, every apartment has its own garden, and it's at 8 meters at the low levels, and then it goes receding, etc. So this is one of the projects. Another project, we do a lot of performing arts. This is another project that really came out of its site, and I think that this is something that you really couldn't replicate. But when we did our research, we were asked to look at an opera house in Alexandria. And when we did our research, every project starts really by understanding where we are working, how do we interact with this place. It was Cleopatra's city. It had sunken due to tsunamis and other conditions, and essentially the site was very close to the entire coast was part of Cleopatra's city, and a French archaeologist went scuba diving around and found these extraordinary sculptures below the ground, and it's something in the water, sorry, and it's something that we just couldn't ignore. It really became a guiding factor for this project. And we wanted to take this idea, it didn't have very much to do with opera, but we wanted to take this idea and think of how we could create a cultural building that would extend beyond its initial use of an opera, and use this idea. The clicker's not working. Oh, there we go. This became a big exhibition that traveled around the world. It was in the British Museum. It was an extraordinary exhibition. The scale of these sculptures were enormous. The site is very close to Ras Al Tin Palace, which is a wonderful site. It sits in front of this wonderful mosque. I'm trying to accelerate because I'm conscious that we only have 5 minutes. And then the notion of arches, Moorish arches, really Islamic architecture invented the idea of the arch. And then looking at scale of Egyptian architecture, which is always very impressive. When you go to the Valley of Kings, there is this sense of scale which is quite different from what we're used to. And working with these elements, not working again. How do I change slides? There we go. The site is on the Mediterranean. It's a wonderful site. It's a landfill. In front of the mosque, we decided to position the opera and take the Mediterranean and create a very large reflecting pool. There was all sorts of notions of the restricted zone. I cannot move the slides. There we go. So we based the building, we shaped the building according to the mosque, and then this idea of the arches and this inspiration of Moorish architecture and the scale of Egyptian architecture. And we started playing with this idea. We didn't want to replicate. We wanted to emulate and change, and we staggered the arches in a different way. So usually arches are adjacent to each other, and then we just staggered them, creating a space and really a building that sits quite lightly on its body of water. And this is a view from it. This is the view of the arches. The scale is quite formidable, and at one point we felt a little bit shy about it, and then we thought, well, you know, we are in Egypt, and they've dealt with this issue before, and here we have. So the idea of the sunken city, we wanted to bring the sunken city back, and we wanted to make this an opera, but also a museum, and so we were able to talk to the clients and ask them if they could consider extending the brief to having a museum of the sunken city, and let's see if that is going to happen. Anyway, thank you very much.
Next up, we have from Italy, the research director with Vittorio Grassi Architetto and Partners. Please join me in welcoming Gianluca Valerio.
Me and my team was trying to understand how to define iconic and icon. And first of all, we can say that icon is a very difficult and interesting topic, but it's really a challenge to define nowadays what it is iconic and what architecture is iconic. So we can say that icon is something which belongs to people, which is referred to a particular cultural period, which is an expression, which is somehow a synthetic image of a complexity which is behind. So one single thing and a lot of information behind that single thing. In the recent period, we can say that in the last few decades, most of the world's greatest architects were asked to design buildings always bigger, stranger, and let's say particular. So we can say iconic architecture is referred to a particular cultural period, which is an expression of technology, political, social, and cultural aspects. But the question behind is this desire of crossing boundaries, of going over limits and, let's say, records, is this going more and more and more, maybe producing something which we cannot control? I'm not saying is a good way or a bad way. I mean, there are many ways to produce iconic building, and we are afraid that this is the effect. I mean, they are all different appearance, but the same structure which is behind all of them. So this could lead to this effect. The effect of copy and paste. It's not because architects are designing always the same buildings or they have the same approach, but it's because in the global age, let's say, architecture from all over the world, from different places, you can see those are some examples, but there are a lot of many. The willing of producing something really unique, something really particular, maybe is leading to have the same result as this one. But in our vision, let's say as office, when we are asked to design a building, we are not asked to design iconic building, but when we are trying to do it, we try to combine altogether social aspect, cultural, and of course, spatial characters. With spatial characters, I mean aesthetical principles, which is the beauty of architecture. I'm just going to show you very, very quickly a few projects from the office, which somehow could be defined as iconic, not because they are an icon of the city, but they are like the image of a process. The first one is, I define a cultural icon. This is our local architect. In Yakutsk, which is a region in the northern east part of Russia. This is iconic in the meaning that is leading a renovation process of the coastline. This is a meeting point of the people which didn't have. So now is in the image, is on the newspaper, is on the, let's say, on the media. They are spreading image because we won this competition. They are spreading image of this building, so this is already an icon before being built. Spatial icon, another project is going on in Russia as well, in Samara, because it took inspiration from the land, from the river, from the curves, from the shape of the terrain. So this is iconic in terms of possibility to recognize themselves in recognize the project into the art, into the landscape. And then a private icon. As I said before, icon is not something related to the impact on the city, but it's related to the possibility to recognize people themselves into it. So this is a private villa in Kuwait. We are building it, actually. This is a private icon in terms of how the client asks us to design the villa and how he can recognize himself into the project. And yeah, of course, it's something different from the context, but at the same time, it's something unique in the context. Small dimension, same impact. And then, yeah, the last one is a social icon. I could say this is a sports center in Lamezia Terme, which is a place in the southern of Italy. And this is social because it's, of course, it's for the people. People can recognize themselves into this new building because there were nothing there. And this is for disabled people, so it's accessible to everybody. So just to summarize, to end up with a definition, we can say that icon is something which is related to the many factors, social, cultural, spatial, but most of all, it's something people can see themselves into it as part of a bigger structure, which is the society. Thank you.
Gianluca, thanks very much indeed. Time permitting, we will get all of these designers, architects up on stage afterwards, and they can answer some of your questions on their theories of iconic structures and perhaps some of the examples that they've been showcasing as well. Now, for our third presentation today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome on stage someone for whom I have enormous personal respect and admiration. Please join me in welcoming, if you would, the founder and director of An Architect, Jonathan Ashmore.
My name is Jonathan Ashmore. I'm the founder and director of Dubai and now London-based practice An Architect. We're a boutique practice, so maybe what I'm presenting today is a little bit different from the two previous panelists. But I was interested to sort of discuss and have the idea with the panel discussion after this about sort of what makes a building truly iconic, and also relating to my experience being here in the UAE, particularly for the last decade. So what makes iconic structures in the region? Why do we do this? I mean, obviously, the modern Gulf cities have, we all know, developed very rapidly and ambitiously over the last couple of decades. So it's been a sort of an understanding as an idea of making a statement to the world, being able to kind of present yourself an attraction for growth and investment. So by looking at these cities like we do and having significant sort of icons like the Burj Khalifa and then subsidiaries and symbolic that make up this sort of city skyline, we've obviously been heavily influenced from other cities looking at a distance like New York, Paris, and London, as previously shown on some slides by the other panelists. For me personally, it's not always about bigger is better, as we've discussed, and also my personal sort of passion for probably one of the most iconic buildings, particularly here in the UAE, is Burj Khalifa, and it's not because of the scale. It's because of the attention to detail. We as a practice are really focused on craft, materiality, and detail. And for me, the passion that comes about something being sort of iconic and symbolic is its sort of synergy from all aspects of design. Going all the way through from the very top, the architectural form, the response and the engineering, right the way through down to the actual landscaping that goes around. This picture is quite inspiring because you don't actually truly understand the epic proportions in which this project was achieved when you start to look at the sort of the planting and the landscaping around it. Obviously, most people see this from an iconic structure from a distance, much like the needle point that it looks in the skyline. So I think for me, this is about almost the beauty of this particular building, why, for me, it's iconic. You know, buildings will become larger and taller, that's inevitable, but I don't think many will achieve the level of detail and quality that they did with this particular building. So when you're asked as architects, you know, I want you to design an iconic structure, that's the agenda, that's the focus. But as architects and as a design team, what is our responsibility to that? Why should we just look at this sort of one point of focus and, as a sort of profession, consider what needs to go around this? As discussed before, the Bilbao effect, the one iconic building, that then what does that create? And being architects and designers from a global perspective, how do we work around those and understand from ideas about what is a driving factor? Is it to attract investment? Is it to attract tourism? Is it to attract communities? You know, what is the primary function? Is it a mixed use? Is it residential? So as iconics are the sole destination, we have to really think about everything that goes along with it to give it longevity, to give it a proper reason why it can become an icon and it can be sustained. It can continue to grow. And, you know, what is the legacy? I mean, that's one of the important parts. So for me, when visiting cities, I come from the UK, I lived most of my life working in London before moving to the UAE. I've been very lucky to travel. You know, what is Dubai's future with iconic structures? Are we going to continue to build taller, better, bigger as a statement? Or do we look at where the opportunities lie within regeneration? This is a very key point that we do as a practice. We look at what we can actually work with existing as well as new build. So I think things like the Dubai World Trade Center, built finished in 1979 and for 20 years was the tallest building in Dubai at that time. And obviously has been since surpassed. But now there is a movement to sort of save these icons, these symbols of the city that were once the icon that made this city great at that period. And now the opportunity is, how can we plug back into these buildings to make them accessible to the public? And how do we infill around them an organic type of infrastructure that makes them sustain, so that in years and years to come, they still exist and people can actually embrace and exist and enjoy them, much like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building does in New York. Other regional successes on a very small scale, but also a very personal passion of mine, is the Sharjah Art Foundation in Sharjah, in the neighboring emirate, executed by Godwin Austen Johnson. The great thing about this building is it's completely contemporary, but the footprint of each of the main galleries was actually based upon the historic plans of a fishing village. The surrounding buildings exist. There's been modified from 1900s, 1910 to 1930s. But the great thing about this, the new program as a contemporary art museum, is what has reinvigorated this entire area and become a destination on an international level. The art is fantastic, and it's got many artists from around the world come and exhibit here. And it's unique. Many sort of art galleries that you go around that are contained within a building, and you walk from gallery to gallery through corridors and staircases. The uniqueness is that this one you walk between the streets, so you truly interact with your context. And this is really driven by the actual locality of this building and the history that was taken as a vernacular. Regional, international successes. Obviously, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott was engaged in London to produce both power stations, been the Bankside and also been the Battersea Power Station. But they've still become and grown as icons because of how we've been able to regenerate them. They don't become sort of, ghosts of the past. And I think that's an important thing when we're looking at iconic and what is the future of iconic, looking at it on a city scale. We've established that impact now in the Middle East and in the UAE. How can we move forward and embrace our existing fabrics? What's also very important is dialogue and the community. What's also really good about this is that the context in which surrounds iconic. I mean, this is a very dramatic kind of picture taken by Dr. Khaled Al-Awaidi, who's just recently curated the National Pavilion of the UAE at the Architecture Biennale in Venice, which I was very privileged to visit. It's about considering about the community, understanding what's around it as well. So lifescapes beyond bigness was an important point he wanted to make. It was a point in which, you know, the worry of this sort of continual growing modern urbanization starts to cut away and delete the fabric that's already there. So I think it's very important in which we actually engage future-wise. The idea of being given a target to do an iconic building is great. It has a purpose. But what goes along with it? And what is the responsibilities as architects and as designers? And you can see the immediate model in the context of that along the Sheikh Zayed Road with all of the repeated icons that all have their own sort of individual iconography, but they don't relate. And I think it's a very important aspect in which this was done, and it should be shared as a sort of body of research when discussing future ideas for icons within the city of Dubai and the fabric beyond. Thank you.
Jonathan, thanks very much indeed. I have never seen the Burj Khalifa from that perspective, and it does make you think twice. A building we've seen for 10 years, but it is a different perspective on that. Now, for the final of our presentations, and let's remind ourselves of the theme here. We're managing partner at Cassia, Jean-Paul Cassia.
Okay. We're all here to tell a story, like all of us, and I'll share with you mine. The company was founded in the late 50s by my late father as an architect artist. Simple program was to create buildings. He was an artist painter. He did over 500 paintings in his lifetime. He studied in Paris, set up the company there, was very close to many of the royals in Saudi Arabia, and for several decades developed projects all across the Arab world. Petrodollars were flowing. Big break in every practice is a memorable one. So in '75, he won a competition to do a project in Abu Dhabi. So we moved to Abu Dhabi for 2 years. It was a desert at the time. And this is me and my sister in front of the Intercontinental. It was at that time that that spirit of excitement that the UAE generated really stuck with me. And so, so you have some images here. And so for 40 years, the company built single one-off buildings, several thousand apartments, all sorts of projects, mixed use. And while all of that was happening, I grew up in Paris, went to school in Boston, and moved to New York. I was a guitarist. I was very fascinated with placemaking in Paris, and of course the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei stirring up a storm with his Louvre renovation. Paris is a place for placemaking, as I said, and cafe culture. And I moved to New York. It's a great place to learn about design, to get married. And then one day I got a phone call from my father in Yemen. He says, "I'm really busy there. Would you please help me with something?" So we put together the sketches. I was fascinated by the Rockefeller Plaza. Never thought we'd won, and in the end we did win. And we moved to Dubai to do the Shangri-La in Dubai. And for about 10 years, I threw myself into the business, touched all sorts of typologies, industrial, retail, mixed use, high-rise, eventscapes, special event plazas. And it was a great period of excitement in the region. All sorts of international star architects came here. And so 20 years later, I.M. Pei and D.D. Pei's office called me to say, "Would you join us?" We were known for creativity and for our attention to detail and execution, so that was quite uncanny. So of course we said yes. And then followed Michael Graves, Cesar Pelli in Abu Dhabi. We helped them on the construction side, KPF. And the practice was growing strong. I was doing projects in Taipei. We were doing retrofit projects in New York, and I was advising a Saudi client for a project in Santa Barbara. We did landscape architecture. We did our own residential building, and fashion-branded hotel in Paris. it really rubbed off this energy here and the collaborations that we were working on. It was a great period. I was always very interested in media. So I was amazed when my father would come back with these enormous mobile phones and, of course, the first Macintosh and the telex. And, you know, over the ages, by 2010, we were on top of our game. We were doing great. And social media was completely the big disruptor. Social media, digital status, the rise of the experience economy. It was a period where, you know, design had truly caught up with innovation, and there was no way for developers to hide. You know, we all became bloggers. We could make and break projects anywhere around the world, and and we were all connected. Of course, it created certain problems, but and it also created some political problems. So by 2010, the crisis hit. We had 400 people from Libya all the way up to Bahrain. And so the crisis hit, and then the Arab Spring, which a lot of people say was sparked by social media. And then my father got sick, and I entered into a period of purgatory. And the big question was, you know, what is it that the markets want? What is it that people really need? Is it the efficiency of how fast we can be or how cheap we can be as designers? Or is it the ideas? And I had to solve these questions, and I was in the United States one summer with family friends, and then on the beach, I was asking, Nina was saying, you know, I'd really love to get into design. I said, well, you know, I know some developers. So I called up the head of CEO of hospitality, and I said, you know, would you be interested in a Cerruti 1881 hotel? He said, sure. So we pitched at the Shanghai Expo. It didn't go through for many reasons, but I had started something. I had realized that, you know, I read an article about Ferrari, whose revenues only represent about 18%, and the rest is all through franchise deals and licensing arrangements. And then I started to look at products and luxury consumer goods and the rise of consumer. And, you know, if Hermès can make chocolates and eventually Tiffany's will make yogurt, then, you know, Four Seasons can team up with airlines. I mean, how many of you would be curious to try a Tiffany's yogurt? But, you know, brands were also extending themselves into popular culture. And so I got very interested in rap with my children, and later on for a brand that I'll talk about in a moment. But, you know, if this innocuous, loudmouth 13-year-old who got discovered on Dr. Phil can rack up 15 million followers in 2 years, singing all sorts of songs, and Gucci, then I said to myself, you know, well, why can't brands and buildings go together? It was an intriguing question, and I realized very quickly that products that people buy is not about the need, but it's about the desire. And as I started to ask myself all these questions, I saw a path. I was going to change the building model from creating buildings to building stories. And this involved a combination of the language that the experience economy needed, which was design and branding, and to really understand all of that. And I set myself a course to find content in these different industries. And of course, these same asset classes were always going to be our focus. And I slowly started surrounding myself with friends, changed our business operating platforms, really wrapped my head around IP laws, marketing, and eventually started to have a very interesting direction for my practice, which was really about building stories. Combination of the three meant that, you know, it doesn't matter how great the building is, with all due respect to the wonderful people here today, yes, buildings need to be efficient and need to respond to all sorts of constraints, but if the story isn't good enough, people just won't buy it. And so very quickly I realized that I wasn't really a designer anymore. I was creating intellectual property. I was interested in intellectual property. And it changed the way we worked and who I worked with and how I approached the business. And of course, our client base started to change. It wasn't developers anymore. It was brands that wanted to enter into real estate, and it was other designers that wanted to differentiate themselves through strong content. So a few case studies of the projects that I've handled. This is in Egypt called the City Stars, mixed use, about 800,000 square meters. As a design entity, we took projects from design all the way through to handing over. So we know the constraints. We were involved on a landscape project in Abu Dhabi, fashion-branded hospitality in Paris with Olivier Lapidus, the son of Ted, who dressed the Beatles for their wedding. He's a great with light and furniture and fabrics and a lifestyle touch throughout. With Philippe, our great friend Philippe Stark and the U team, it's about adding an architectural cloak to the brands that they have. And so with branded design is very much right in the beginning of a project. So what is branded design? Very, very early in the beginning, you start with the volume strategies, you start with a vision, you start with amenities programs. In the case of Philippe Stark, of course, it's a lot of product design, so there's the Stark tectonic, which you need to explore. Every brand has its story, every brand has its DNA. This is a project close to Dubai that we're designing. We program great amenity spaces, amazing interiors, 10-foot wraparound building, wraparound balconies. It's by the sea. This is in Bangkok. With a multi-brand strategy, we haven't decided. It's a little bit like designing a hotel. If the operator isn't there in the beginning, you have a problem. So it's the same thing with branded real estate. If you don't have the brand at the beginning, you've got a problem. So this developer discovered that a bit too late. And this is an exploration of a project here in Dubai. This is a project that's nearly finishing. It's actually a very interesting residential project for Dubai. I was approached by a very special person to do a high-rise. He said, I want a fashion-branded hotel in Dubai. I said, okay, I got one. And I said the first thing I told him when I met him, I said, you remind me of this painting by Adolphe Yvon of Napoleon III handing the decree for the annexation of the suburbs of Paris. It was a genuine comparison because not many people shape history, urban history, like some of the people in this country. It's quite extraordinary. Of course, design responds to the normal process of all the constraints, the design discovery, the breakthrough sketches. Dubai is all about the convergence of people, hence the building shape. In this building, there's a whole multi-brand strategy that we've put together, and we work with amazing engineers, some of the best engineers in town. In Da Nang, we were invited by a client to create a brand for him, so we created the brand around the word pure in Vietnamese, which is called Tat. I went to New York, I spent 6 years there, so the High Line was a great inspiration. And I designed this in Miami while I was on a tour with Thierry Mugler, the French fashion designer. He says, what is that? And I said, it's a project we're doing in Da Nang. He said, I want to be part of it. So we programmed early in the design phase the branding. The branding. And so this is an example of a Mugler project. We're doing Malibu. The process of design is the same, but when it's branded, you really, especially with Thierry, he takes a lot of care on the PR. So the PR becomes part of the language of the design, and of course, casts a spotlight on the project. I have to go fast. With Lanvin, with some luxury brand, it's all about making their customers dream. So we signed the license with them early March, and then very quickly signed a contract for an amazing resort in Mauritius. With Sarah's Grey, my partner Olivier Lapidus was designing dresses for Sarah Rafferty, the wedding. I didn't know suits at the time, but it was very interesting. So we designed themes around the brand. She lives half the year in LA, half the year in Toronto. And when we did the shoot, I said, we're all here to create a story, a little bit like all of us here today. With David, and so it's very interesting. Then brands started contacting me. So David Guetta called, I heard you do this, and I said yes. And it's about creating an immersive real estate destination with music, hospitality, and residential. I got some interesting people involved, and we went very fast. The brand equity means that the editorials will follow very quickly. And lots of brands came, and we created incredible, interesting stories with amazing people that are very interested in real estate. And I discovered something, that a lot of lot of real estate developers are very fascinated by the digital world that surrounds us. And so as we all live in buildings, it's a very important thing to remember that it's about the lifestyle that people want and about the way they want to live, the way they wish to surround themselves with. And so, of course, brand engagement has become a big part of my business. Brands add lots of value to real estate. In some cases, it's 15%. In some cases, 50%. It adds a tremendous amount of recognition. And the developers behind these projects are all the ones that, are partners in the process. We help with marketing intent, and brochures and websites. And in conclusion, I discovered that the language of design and the excellence that's required to create great assets can really unlock value if it has the right story. And there are different types of stories, but it's all about creating great designs. And in our case, it's about harnessing the power of the editorials in order to bring out the project and the and the building story. So that's it in a nutshell. I suppose this is the target. Thank you.
Jean-Paul, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Have a seat, please, Jean-Paul.
Thank you.
Can I invite the panelists to join us back on stage, please? We're going to very quickly take some rapid-fire questions, and it is going to be rapid-fire question. If you have a question or comment from the floor, don't be shy. This is probably a 5-minute rapid-fire Q&A session. I do like your idea of storytelling, Jean-Paul. As a journalist who owns an architecture firm with my wife, the one crumb of value I add, and it's a tiny crumb, is that I can help with storytelling sometimes, and that's about the end of it. Right, who's got the first question for our panel? Yes, please. Thank you very much indeed. Can we get a microphone to this lady, please, right down at the front? Quick questions and quick answers, please. You don't all have to agree. You don't all have to play nicely together.
Almost every tender that we're receiving at the moment in Dubai is pretty much requesting an iconic building. Would you say that the power of iconic buildings is effectively being lost by the number of clients who are requesting iconic in their design?
Christina, ladies first.
I'm not 100% convinced that you design an iconic building. I think a building somehow through its history and its interaction with the city will either become iconic or not. And I think, Jonathan touched upon the notion of the quality of the detail and I think I 100% believe in that. And I think the problem with trying to be iconic is you can fall very easily into the notion of fashion. And fashion is very short-lived. It has fashion changes all the time. And buildings, hopefully, if they're good, will remain a much longer period. So it's a very dangerous game to play, I think. And I think who knew that, I don't